obviously you have a sheet in front of you, but the reason I'm projecting this is on the recording. This will be projected on the screen if somebody plays it back so you know where we're at. So the design argument, and even though we're not covering it, the cosmological argument, both of those are a posteriori. That is, they depend on experiences about the world. But by the way, you might want to also remember that another word for the design argument is the teleological argument. Teleological, from the word telos for goal or purpose. You see, if you grew up with a strong religious background and believe that God created the world with certain built-in purposes, like Paley does, like Aquinas does, and like even Aristotle did, although he didn't have the concept of the Judeo-Christian concept of God, still Aristotle looks at nature with built-in purposes. Now, even though Sir Isaac Newton was a pretty devout Christian believer himself, the world of nature that Newton gives us basically takes those purposes out of nature and looks at it as a totally mechanical system with scientific laws that govern the behavior of things in the world, but it does not look at it as a world where things should be looked at in terms of their purposes or goals or functions. And similarly, I almost hesitate to mention anything about evolution because I'm sure you've had it drummed into you so much that you could teach me things about it. But remember, while there have been, and you can hold a position called theistic evolution, where you believe that God had a hand in the evolutionary process and did build goals and purposes in. Not Sir Isaac Newton, but Charles Darwin's original concept of evolution was that it was not aimed at a particular goal, at a telos. It was a totally random process, and that it produced us is just basically a happy accident of history for a completely naturalistic viewpoint on evolution. And so, after Newton and after Darwin, you got views of the world that tend to take the purposes out of nature, right? I was talking about a random process like shaking dice in a dice shaker and throwing them out. And literally, even Stephen Jay Gould, who was a famous evolutionary advocate in our own century, just died about 5 to 10 years ago. He said, look, if we ran that random process over again from scratch, there's no guarantee at all that it would produce us or anything like us. So this is the view, the completely naturalistic view of evolution, and I'll talk about how it relates to Hume later. But believers, even after Aristotle, saw nature as imbued with things that serve various functions or purposes. And theologians like Aquinas added to Aristotle's view that there are purposes in nature the additional assumption that these are put in there by God the Creator. So, in Aquinas' fifth way, and that's the only one of his 5 ways we've considered, right? The first 3 ways are versions of the cosmological argument, the argument that God is needed as a necessary first cause of the cosmos. The fourth one we don't worry about. Basically, it's only the fifth one that's a real early statement of the design argument. And so, why can't things in nature direct themselves toward a goal or purpose? Aquinas, like Aristotle, views things as having purposes, but of course the answer is that they don't have an intelligence. They lack understanding, as he says. And so, lacking intelligence, they can't direct themselves to fulfill a particular goal or, create themselves such that that happens. We saw that he uses the metaphor of an archer shooting an arrow. So to achieve the goal of hitting the bullseye on the target, you don't just set up, and shoot an arrow. You need an intelligence directing that arrow to its goal or target. And so the idea is an idea that we'll see Hume challenges. But for Aquinas, if you don't have an intelligence in the things themselves, directing them toward a goal, then you need an external intelligence to build them or make them such that their parts work together to achieve a purpose. And it's this claim that we saw Hume takes issue with. He says, well, some things that are ordered in nature might have an intelligence directing them, but not everything needs an external intelligence. So Hume would say, you're wrong to conclude that if they aren't intelligent themselves, then an external artificer, an external mind from outside is needed. Hume claims that there might be forces in nature that tend things toward order rather than disorder. So who fulfills the need then of building purposes into things? Well, obviously God himself. And of course, Aquinas, I don't think would have, now remember Aquinas is living probably 500 years or so before David Hume, but I don't think he would be very impressed with Hume's logical points about the fact that the premises of the design argument could have other conclusions, like that the world was built by some semi-incompetent, senile god or some new god that was just learning how to make worlds and botched this world and went on to the next, like, as I said before, like somebody taking their first pottery course. I mean, basically, for Aquinas, there's only one option that we ought to take seriously, and that's that the person who creates the world and builds purposes into things is God himself, the God of the Bible and church tradition. And Paley, much later, is a Protestant theologian, but he has the same view of the world, that things in nature are imbued with purposes, right? So what made the watch different from the stone? Well, I had some interesting comments on my online class at CCBC when they covered this section in a discussion forum. I don't do discussion forums for face-to-face classes, but it's the only way you can get students to interact in an online course. And some of them said, well, wait a second, it's the assumption of the Judeo-Christian worldview that God created everything, stones and ears and eyes. Well, yes, that's true, but here again, Paley thinks it's important to focus on those things in nature that have parts that seem to serve functions and purposes, right? So what made the watch different is that unlike the stone, it seemed to serve a function or purpose. Now, it's interesting, I talk about an introduction to the world of work. My brother wasn't even 16 yet, but we found we could meet a truck that would take us to do sod laying in the summers. You were glad if you woke up and it was raining that day because you had an excuse not to go out. But it paid more than the minimum wage, which for like a 15 and 16-year-old kid was a deal there. But I remember one time when they were digging from a foundation and somebody came up with what was clearly parts of a stone axe, right? That it was cut out. So stones can be molded, to serve purposes like a stone axe, but for the most part, stones don't do that. So why does this difference imply a different answer? Well, again, he says Paley says, look, there's nothing alarming in assuming that things like the rock got there by completely natural forces. And I used a ballpoint pen. I said, if you're walking across campus and you look on the ground and you see blades of grass and you might see some stones, small stones, or you might see twigs that fell from trees, you have no problem assuming that stuff got there totally as a result of purely natural processes in the environment. But if you saw a ballpoint pen lying there, and as I mean, people are dropping them out of their pockets all the time walking across campus, you wouldn't say to yourself, well, isn't that interesting? Nature came together here to produce things like blades of grass and stones and twigs, and look at that, the forces of nature just happened to come together in this place to produce a ballpoint pen, right? None of us would say that. And why wouldn't we say that? Because the pen is a mechanism that is specifically made so that its parts would serve a purpose. So let's talk about the argument from analogy for a minute. As I said, an argument from analogy basically, in its simplest form, it says two things are alike in certain respects. In this case, take the eye. Paley is saying, well, look, the eye is like the watch in the respect that they both have a lot of complicated parts that aren't just thrown together willy-nilly, but that work together as part of a mechanism to serve a purpose. You know, the parts of a watch move the hand so that we can use it to tell time. The parts of the eye enable it to be an organ for sight. So he says, here are similarities that we could observe, right? That's why the design argument is a posteriori. We're saying here are some observations we can make about how things actually are in the world. But then the conclusion of the argument goes beyond our experience. It says, well, look, a man-made item like the watch didn't just get that way from nature, that the parts work together to serve a purpose, but a man-made item like a watch was planned and designed and put together so that those parts do what they're supposed to do. So, in other words, an argument from analogy says, if things are alike in some respects, then probably they're alike in a further respect that's not so obvious. So if you say, well, look, the watch needed a maker and designer, therefore, a mechanism like the eye also needed a maker and designer. So there's the conclusion of the argument from analogy, that if things like the watch and the eye are alike in some respects, then they're also alike in the further respect of needing a designer. Now, Hume challenges the analogy by saying we can't compare the making of the world to the making of fabricated items, that it's not a good analogy. But Hume doesn't address Paley's point, which is a point that Cleanthes raises in Hume's own thing. Is there a much closer similarity when we compare things in nature that serve a purpose, like eyes and ears, to created things like watches and houses? So, at any rate, Hume says we're really comparing two very different things when we compare manufactured items like ships and houses. It's Paley who uses a watch, not Hume. They had watches around. It just wasn't Hume's choice, to the universe. Now, the design argument. And by the way, we did not cover the problem of evil, and probably won't have time to fit it in. I think we may go elsewhere. So even though this mentions the problem of evil, there's not going to be questions on the test about it. So again, after Newton, people viewed the universe as being like a giant machine. We even had this phrase, the clockwork universe. And so basically Cleanthes says the universe is like a giant machine, in other words, the whole orbits of the planets and all were thought to be like just one big machine. And it has in it a number of smaller machines. And here he's referring to the kinds of stuff that he points out later, like ears and eyes and the parts of plants and animals that work together to serve purposes. So I kind of described the basics of the analogy. And so now the interesting thing about the ontological argument is if it works, it seems to prove the existence of a God that has all of the traditional attributes of God that the Judeo-Christian tradition wants to say are characteristic of God. With things like the design argument, you don't get all of it necessarily. But minimally, if the argument works, it says, well, probably the designer of things like the eye and ear, if God is their designer, probably that designer has characteristics like human characteristics. In other words, enough intelligence to be able to design and produce something that fulfills a function or purpose. And probably also God has or is a far greater mind because the products of divine design are infinitely more complicated than the simple things we make, like ships and houses. So now Philo, we're not going to worry much about Philo, but Philo would rather see a mathematically precise a priori argument like the design, the analogical argument. So he kind of quibbles with arguments like the design argument that are just probabilistic. And this is a logical point, but I'm not going to ask you this. An argument from analogy is what we call an inductive argument. It establishes its conclusion only with a degree of probability, not with mathematical certainty like an a priori argument. Not all inductive arguments are arguments from analogy. There are different types of inductive arguments. But all arguments from analogy are inductive arguments. That is, they're all probabilistic, you know. So at best, an argument like the design argument only establishes that it's more probable than not that there was an intelligent designer of the universe, namely God. But Hume says there are good and bad arguments from analogy, and the closer the things you're comparing in the analogy are to one another, the stronger is your analogy and the stronger evidence your argument gives for its conclusion. We saw him illustrate this point with blood flow in human beings, animals, and he's saying if you get very far away in the things you're comparing, you could even be led astray to a false conclusion, like that sap circulates in vegetables the same way it does in animals, which it does not. Okay, it's coming up from the roots now. That's why we're starting to see spring flowers. But it doesn't circulate. So there are some superficial similarities, like sap goes in tubules in trees and various plants. Like, you notice this if you cut a corn stalk and look at it. So what is Hume trying to say? what's lying under this, right? Isn't he trying to imply, well, look, if the design argument is a bad analogy, couldn't you be led to the false conclusion that God exists? When Hume is at least an agnostic, probably an atheist. So, again, a building like a house in the analogy is compared to the universe. That's why he says it's a bad analogy. But again, I say he doesn't address the point that, well, yeah, but isn't it much closer to compare something like a watch or a ship to an organ like the eye? And even Cleanthes brings this stuff up. Hume doesn't answer this. So, let you think about that. So, order and design, basically, Hume has the same view of nature that Darwin had. That you can see order in nature, but that order is not there as a result of deliberate design. Does order always imply design? Hume's answer is no. And so Philo brings in, remember Hume, as I said, is not a scientist, but as an intelligent person in his day, he knows something of the science of his day. He knows about external forces like, in chemistry and in magnetism and stuff. And so he says, well, maybe there are just natural forces that produce order. And design is only one possible cause of order, but the design argument focuses on only that. And of course, this was Darwin's view, right? Darwin's view of something like the eye is that it's not designed and built to fulfill a particular function, but that through millions of years, you have increasingly complex organisms developing, that organisms adjust or adapt to their environment, and some of them develop what are called advantageous variations that give them a leg up in the constant evolutionary struggle for survival. And so natural selection selects them to survive and reproduce and makes extinct other members of the species that don't have those advantageous variations. So the Darwinian story vis-a-vis something like the eye is that, well, it's not designed and built like a watch is designed and built, or a home is, or a ship all at once, but that a totally random process through adaptation of things to their environment and natural selection over millions of years produces increasingly complex organisms with increasingly complex eyes. And so the eye, lo and behold, does become, for Darwin, a product of just blind chance and natural forces working, So Hume speculates about order coming from nature, but all he can do is kind of throw out a few possibilities, whereas Darwin tries to sharpen that up. Now, I told you all, and I'm not going to ask you this, but the most contemporary versions of the design argument focus on where I have problems, and have since my high school days, since I read Lecomte de Noy's Human Destiny, book written by a scientist, and at one point he shows the astronomical probabilities against even one strand of DNA coming about totally as a result of natural processes. So the modern version of the design argument says the chances against life developing are astronomical. And so an external cause, an external force was needed to set up precise conditions in the universe that would allow life to happen. I mean, one example, a textbook I used to use, and I don't want to take too much time with this, but is the ozone layer. As a ham radio operator, we know all about, that, we're, bouncing signals off of it. The point is, it's a particular thickness. If it were much thicker, it would filter out too much helpful light, and life would not have developed the way it has. If it were too much thinner, then too many harmful rays of the sun would have been let through, and again, it would have been problematic for life to develop, but it happens to be just the thickness it needs. And of course, an evolutionist can reply with a kind of chicken and egg argument and say, well, wait a second. It isn't that the ozone layer was designed to be just the thickness it is so life can come about, but that the life forms that actually survived in the evolutionary struggle for existence are those that thrive best with the ozone layer, the thickness that it is. So this is a continuing debate. Okay. All right. So and again, Hume says, even if we had a perfect universe, we couldn't conclude its maker is perfect. Somebody might have just copied something. Also, he says from the same premises, we could get various versions of designers, Now, I took a lot of time on this because we just did Descartes, but let me run through some of Descartes real quickly. Well, he needs to examine his beliefs because he thinks a lot of false beliefs have crept into philosophy and his own personal philosophy. And he wants to set everything on new foundations. So what needs to be done, he thinks, is for philosophy and scientific knowledge, we need to set it all up just like Euclid in Plato's day set up the kind of geometry you took as plain geometry in high school. That is, the whole of knowledge needs to be put on a firm foundation of a few absolutely certain first principles. So how's he going to do this? Well, he uses, in other words, to search for absolutely certain principles that are beyond doubt, he uses methodical doubt, methodological skepticism, hyperbolic doubt. All of those are phrases that refer to Descartes' method. In other words, in order to search for certain principles, he uses skeptical arguments to doubt everything he can possibly doubt until hopefully he finds at least one principle that's beyond doubt. So the dream conjecture enables him to call into doubt any of the beliefs we have through our senses. And that includes ordinary beliefs about what we were talking about at the beginning, about what's going on in the room, that we're in a room filled with real material objects. But it also raises doubt about any observational sciences that depend on information from the senses, whether it be chemistry, astronomy, whatever. And these were around in rudimentary forms in Descartes' day. But Descartes says, look, if things are very clear, even in some dreams, doesn't that raise for me the question of whether the experiences I'm now having are part of a continuous dream? You know, here again, we get back to the egocentric predicament. The mind, or the part of us that's aware of what's going on, is like it's in the center of a theater, and it knows only its own experiences, inner mental life, and that raises a question of whether anything in those experiences is what it seems to be. We saw in The Matrix, for Neo and the other people in the world who had this program piped into them, nothing was as it seemed to be. They weren't in the 1990s in small town America. They were in those pods, right, having this program create experiences for them that were totally wrong. So Descartes says, well, how do I know for sure I'm not dreaming? And that's where he raises these questions about, for him, he says, possible tests like noticing my eyes are open. Hey, I'm not dreaming, my eyes are open. Well, yeah, but you could be in a dream and noticing in a dream that the dream image of you has its eyes open, right? So he says that's not a sure test. Now, I think John Locke thought that pain was a very good mark. Think about it. You don't usually feel pain in a dream. But I've had students write on this who say they have. But he, again, why doesn't it work for mathematics? Because the principles of mathematics seem to work even for dream objects. So that's why he's got to bring in the evil genius. Okay. Again, I may have gone farther in the recorded version that's out there, you know, but I at least wanted to go back because we just did Locke. So again, bring your completed essay Monday along with a Scantron, and we do have class Friday with Dr. Scott, Dr. David Scott as the guest speaker. Okay, if anybody needs a review sheet or a question pool, they're up on the front desk if you came in late and missed one. And make sure you're on the roll.